The intersection of idealistic environmental policy and rigid fiscal conservatism has long served as the primary battleground for the future of American governance. This tension reached a symbolic peak in a discourse surrounding the Green New Deal, a proposal as vast in its social ambition as it is daunting in its projected costs. While proponents argue that the survival of the planet justifies any price tag, critics maintain that even the most noble intentions must eventually bow to the laws of arithmetic. The dialogue between these two factions represents a fundamental rift in how a modern superpower should balance its moral obligations against its literal bank account. This ideological collision is often personified by figures who stand at opposite ends of the political and generational spectrum. On one side, we see the push for a radical restructuring of the economy to mitigate climate collapse and systemic inequality. On the other, there is a demand for a granular accounting of every taxpayer dollar, insisting that passion is no substitute for a balanced ledger. The debate is no longer just about carbon emissions or renewable energy credits. It has evolved into a high-stakes trial of whether a nation can afford its own dreams without triggering a catastrophic financial insolvency. When examining the mechanics of massive public spending, the numbers often escalate into a stratosphere that the average citizen finds difficult to comprehend. Proponents of sweeping legislative packages frequently utilize a rhetoric of urgency, framing the expenditure as a necessary investment rather than a standard cost. They suggest that the long-term savings from preventing environmental disasters will far outweigh the immediate trillions required for implementation. However, this macroeconomic optimism frequently meets stiff resistance from those who view the federal budget as a finite resource governed by basic math. The skeptical perspective argues that no amount of social justification can fill a hole in a budget that spans several zeros beyond the current national debt. In this view, the grandiosity of a policy is irrelevant if the math required to fund it remains fundamentally broken or unaddressed. This clash highlights a recurring theme in Washington where the visionary meets the auditor in a room filled with tension and high stakes. The resulting friction often produces a political theater that captures the national imagination, forcing a public reckoning with the true cost of progress. The narrative of a simple calculator challenging a trillion-dollar vision serves as a powerful metaphor for this enduring struggle. It simplifies a complex bureaucratic process into a digestible conflict between common sense and perceived fiscal recklessness. By focusing on the tangible, like a $5 device, critics of expensive policies aim to demystify the complex economic models used by their opponents. This strategy is designed to bring the conversation back to the kitchen table, where every dollar must be accounted for and every debt eventually paid. It is essential to recognize that the push for green initiatives is driven by a genuine concern for the habitability of the future world. To its supporters, the Green New Deal is not just a policy but a moral imperative that transcends the traditional constraints of partisan budgeting. They argue that the current economic system is fundamentally flawed because it fails to account for the negative externalities of industrial pollution. Therefore, the high cost of the proposal is seen as a long overdue correction rather than an act of fiscal irresponsibility. Conversely, the demand for fiscal rigor is rooted in the belief that a collapsed economy would be just as devastating as a changing climate. If a nation devalues its currency or drowns in debt to fund environmental projects, it may lose the very stability required to maintain those systems. This perspective posits that the best way to help the environment is through sustainable, market-driven innovation rather than massive, government-led spending programs. The debate thus becomes a choice between a state-directed transformation and a more cautious, incremental approach to change. The political theater surrounding these discussions often goes viral because it reflects the deep-seated anxieties of a polarized electorate. In an era of short attention spans, a sharp exchange about budget deficits can become a defining moment for a movement or a career. These moments are amplified by social media, where complex policy debates are often reduced to a battle of wits and sound bites. While this can lead to a simplified understanding of the issues, it also forces politicians to sharpen their arguments and face their critics. As the discourse shifts from emotional rhetoric to financial scrutiny, both sides are forced to adapt their strategies to maintain credibility. The progressive movement has begun to integrate more detailed economic modeling into their proposals to answer the charge of being unrealistic. Meanwhile, fiscal conservatives are under increasing pressure to offer their own solutions to the climate crisis that do not rely solely on cutting spending. This evolution suggests that even the most heated confrontations can lead to a more nuanced and productive national conversation over time. The fundamental conflict remains whether the cold reality of budget mathematics can ever be reconciled with the heated passion of social change. Some believe that a middle ground can be found through technological breakthroughs that lower the cost of green energy, making the math work for everyone. Others remain convinced that the two sides are irreconcilable, representing a permanent divide in the American political identity. Regardless of the outcome, the dialogue itself serves as a crucial check and balance on the power of unchecked idealism and rigid austerity. The role of the Budget Committee is to serve as the gatekeeper of the nation's financial health, a task that often puts it at odds with legislative ambition. When a representative or senator brings a proposal to the floor, they are expected to provide a credible path for funding, a requirement that is often easier said than out loud. The scrutiny applied in these rooms is intended to ensure that the government does not overextend itself to the point of no return. It is a grueling process of line-item vetoes and pointed questions that can make or break the most popular of political agendas. In this environment, the use of basic arithmetic is not just a tactic. It is a fundamental tool of governance. By breaking down a multi-trillion-dollar plan into its component parts, a critic can expose the gaps in logic that might be hidden by grand rhetoric. This approach appeals to a sense of pragmatism that is deeply ingrained in the American character, even as the country grows more divided. It reminds the public that while dreams are free, the infrastructure required to realize them is decidedly not, and someone must always pay the bill. The impact of these debates on public opinion cannot be overstated, as they often dictate the legislative priorities of the coming years. When a policy is perceived as fiscally sound, it has a much higher chance of gaining the bipartisan support necessary for long-term success. On the other hand, a policy that is seen as a mathematical impossibility will often struggle to gain traction beyond a core group of supporters. This reality forces policymakers to be more disciplined in their approach, ensuring that their visions are backed by more than just good intentions. Ultimately, the goal of any political discourse should be to find a path forward that preserves both the planet and the economy. The tension between the advocate for change and the guardian of the Treasury is a healthy one, as it prevents either extreme from dominating the narrative. By engaging in these high-stakes debates, the nation can weigh the risks and rewards of different paths, leading to a more informed and resilient society. The clash of ideas is not a sign of failure, but a sign of a functioning democracy that is wrestling with its most difficult challenges. The debate over the Green New Deal is not merely a disagreement over policy details, but a fundamental dispute over the role of government in the 21st century. To understand the gravity of this confrontation, one must look past the immediate political theatre and examine the structural economic theories at play. Proponents often lean into modern monetary theory, suggesting that a country with its own sovereign currency can sustain higher debt levels to fund essential public goods. This school of thought posits that as long as inflation remains under control, the federal government should prioritize full employment and environmental stability over a balanced budget. However, this theoretical framework faces a stern challenge from traditional economists who warn of the long-term consequences of such an expansive monetary policy. They argue that excessive government spending inevitably leads to a crowding out effect, where public debt absorbs the capital that would otherwise drive private sector innovation. When a legislative body considers a proposal that reaches into the tens of trillions, the margin for error becomes razor-thin, and the potential for systemic failure grows. This is why the introduction of a simple calculator into a high-level hearing is so rhetorically effective. It anchors a theoretical debate in the concrete reality of tax revenue versus expenditures. The skepticism voiced by fiscal conservatives often centers on the feasibility of transitioning an entire national power grid within a single decade. While the goal of reaching net zero emissions is widely shared, the logistical and financial hurdles of decommissioning existing infrastructure are monumental. Critics point out that the cost of raw materials, labor, and new technology often exceeds initial estimates, leading to budget creep that can paralyze a nation's economy. By demanding a line-by-line accounting, these critics are not necessarily denying the climate crisis, but rather questioning the efficiency of a state-managed solution. In response, the progressive wing of the legislature asserts that the cost of the status quo is a hidden tax on every American citizen. They highlight the rising expenses associated with disaster relief, healthcare costs from pollution, and the loss of agricultural productivity due to extreme weather. From this perspective, the Green New Deal is an insurance policy designed to prevent an even more expensive collapse in the future. They argue that the traditional methods of accounting are outdated because they do not include the social cost of carbon, which masks the true price of fossil fuel reliance. This ideological tug-of-war creates a unique pressure on the individuals who represent these viewpoints in the public eye. For a young legislator, the challenge is to maintain the momentum of a grassroots movement while proving that their plans are not just idealistic fantasies. For a seasoned senator, the goal is to act as a reality check, using their experience to point out the unintended consequences of rapid, large-scale intervention. When these two forces meet, the resulting sparks provide the public with a rare glimpse into the actual machinery of power and the difficulty of reaching a national consensus. The viral nature of these encounters often stems from the audience's desire for clarity in an increasingly complex world. When a politician uses a basic tool to challenge a sophisticated proposal, it resonates with people who feel overwhelmed by the scale of modern government. It creates a narrative of the common man standing up to a bureaucratic elite, regardless of whether that narrative accurately reflects the nuances of the policy. This type of political branding is highly effective in a media landscape that rewards sharp, confrontational moments over long-form deliberation. Furthermore, the impact on the progressive movement itself cannot be ignored, as these public challenges often lead to internal policy refinements. After facing intense scrutiny regarding the price tag of their proposals, many advocates have begun to seek out more diverse funding streams, such as green bonds and public-private partnerships. This shift suggests that the trial by fire in congressional committees serves a vital function in the legislative process. It forces the most ambitious ideas to be tempered by the practicalities of governance, ensuring that they are more robust if they ever move toward implementation. The international community also watches these American debates with great interest, as the United States often sets the tone for global climate policy. If the world's largest economy cannot find a way to make the math work for a green transition, other nations may be hesitant to commit to their own expensive targets. The domestic struggle over the budget thus has far-reaching implications for global diplomacy and the future of international environmental agreements. The calculator on the Senate floor is, in a sense, a message to the world about the limits of American fiscal capacity. As we move further into the decade, the pressure to reconcile these two opposing views will only intensify as the effects of climate change become more pronounced. The question of how will we pay for it will remain the central hurdle for any major legislative effort, regardless of which party is in power. Both sides will need to move beyond sound bites and start engaging in the difficult work of prioritizing which investments are truly essential. This will require a level of political courage and compromise that is currently in short supply in Washington's polarized atmosphere. Ultimately, the clash between the vision for a green future and the reality of a national budget is a test of a democracy's ability to solve complex problems. It is easy to propose grand ideas, and it is equally easy to say no to them. The hard part is finding the narrow path that allows for progress without bankruptcy. The dialogue must continue, even when it is uncomfortable or confrontational, because the stakes are too high for either side to simply walk away. The balance between the heart and the ledger is where the most enduring policies are forged. The role of the public in this process is to remain informed and to demand more than just rhetoric from their leaders. Citing a multi-trillion-dollar figure without a clear plan for implementation is just as irresponsible as dismissing a crisis because the solution is expensive. By understanding the economic trade-offs involved, voters can better evaluate the promises made on the campaign trail. This creates a more accountable political environment where math is not used as a weapon, but as a shared language for solving the nation's most pressing issues. In the end, the images of these heated hearings serve as a reminder that politics is the art of the possible. While the dreamers push the boundaries of what we can achieve, the pragmatists ensure that we have a solid foundation upon which to build. Both roles are necessary for a healthy society, and the friction between them is the engine of democratic evolution. As long as there are those willing to challenge the status quo and those willing to defend the Treasury, the debate over the future of the American economy will remain vibrant and essential. The evolution of this political standoff has forced a significant recalibration of how economic credibility is measured in the hallowed halls of the United States Senate. For decades, the primary metric of a policy's success was its projected impact on the gross domestic product, but the modern era has introduced far more volatile variables. When critics demand a rigorous accounting of a plan as expansive as the Green New Deal, they are often pointing toward the looming specter of hyperinflation. The concern is that an artificial infusion of trillions of dollars into specific sectors could decouple the value of the currency from the actual productivity of the nation. This fear of inflationary pressure is not merely a theoretical exercise for those who guard the national treasury. It is a lived reality for millions of Americans facing rising costs. From the perspective of the fiscal hawks, a policy that purports to save the environment but destroys the purchasing power of the middle class is a Pyrrhic victory. They argue that the most vulnerable populations are the ones who suffer most when the government ignores the foundational principles of supply and demand. By insisting on a simple mathematical justification for every new program, these leaders position themselves as the final line of defense against a devalued future. Progressive advocates, however, counter this narrative by highlighting the systemic inefficiencies of the current carbon-heavy economy that the budget currently ignores. They point to the massive subsidies currently enjoyed by the fossil fuel industry as a form of corporate welfare that is rarely subjected to the same level of scrutiny. In their view, the $5 calculator is a selective tool, used to bash new social investments while remaining silent on existing military and industrial expenditures. This counterargument suggests that the debate over affordability is often a mask for a debate over national priorities and who deserves to benefit from federal resources. The tension further escalates when discussing the labor market, as any massive green transition would require total realignment of the American workforce. Proponents promise the creation of millions of high-paying union jobs in the renewable energy sector, effectively building a new industrial base for the country. Skeptics remain unconvinced, noting that the transition costs for retraining workers and the potential loss of jobs in traditional energy sectors are often omitted from the glossy brochures of activists. They demand to see the math on how a coal miner in West Virginia or an oil rigger in Texas fits into this new, expensive world. As these arguments play out in front of television cameras, the audience is treated to a masterclass in the art of political framing and rhetorical combat. A well-placed question about the specific cost of a single provision can stall the momentum of a multi-billion-dollar bill and force its sponsors into a defensive posture. This is the essence of congressional oversight, where the goal is to peel back the layers of a proposal until its core assumptions are exposed. Whether the proposal survives this process often depends less on its moral clarity and more on its ability to withstand a relentless mathematical assault. The psychological impact of these hearings on the voting public is profound, as it shifts the focus from what we want to what we can sustain. In a culture that is increasingly comfortable with debt at the personal level, the reminder of the national debt serves as a sobering wake-up call. It forces a conversation about the legacy we are leaving for future generations, not just in terms of the climate, but in terms of financial solvency. This intergenerational conflict is at the heart of the budget debate, as both sides claim to be the true protectors of the youth's future. Furthermore, the role of independent budget officers and nonpartisan auditors becomes critical during these moments of high-octane political theater. These institutions provide the data that both sides weaponize, yet they also offer a baseline of reality that prevents the debate from drifting entirely into the realm of fiction. When a senator cites a specific deficit projection, they are leaning on the institutional weight of these auditors to give their skepticism a sense of objective truth. This reliance on data, even when used as a political cudgel, reinforces the idea that numbers still matter in the governance of a superpower. The shift toward fiscal rigor has also forced the progressive movement to seek out more innovative and market-friendly ways to achieve their environmental goals. We are seeing a greater emphasis on carbon pricing, tax credits for private innovation, and the use of leverage to encourage private capital to lead the way. This greening of finance is a direct result of the realization that the federal government cannot simply print its way to a new climate reality. It is a sign that the pressure of the Budget Committee is working, driving policy toward more sustainable and less disruptive models of change. The media coverage of these events often ignores these subtle policy shifts in favor of the more dramatic clash of personalities that drives clicks and views. Yet, beneath the surface of the viral videos, a more serious and consequential negotiation is taking place between the two wings of the American political establishment. This negotiation is where the actual laws are written, far from the glare of the spotlights and the performative use of office supplies. It is a process of attrition where the most radical ideas are slowly ground down into something that can actually pass a floor vote. Ultimately, the power of a simple mathematical challenge lies in its ability to strip away the complexity and reveal the underlying choices we face as a society. Every dollar spent on one priority is a dollar taken away from another, and a nation that refuses to choose is a nation that is headed for a crisis. The dialogue between the visionary and the accountant is a permanent feature of the American experiment, ensuring that our reach never exceeds our grasp for too long. This balance, though often messy and contentious, is what has allowed the country to survive and thrive through centuries of change. As the session breaks and the cameras go dark, the numbers remain on the whiteboard, waiting for the next round of debate and the next fiscal year. The battle over the Green New Deal is just one chapter in a much longer story about how we define the American dream in an age of limits. It is a story that requires both the courage to imagine a better world and the discipline to pay for it, 1 cent at a time. The tension is not a bug in the system. It is the system itself, working exactly as it was designed to do. The geopolitical implications of American fiscal policy are often overlooked in the heat of domestic partisan warfare, yet they form the backbone of the nation's global standing. When a legislative body debates a spending package of unprecedented scale, the primary concern for international observers is the stability of the United States dollar as the world's reserve currency. If the math behind a green transition appears shaky or disconnected from reality, it sends a ripple of uncertainty through global markets that rely on American solvency. Critics who bring a calculator to a hearing are not just performing for a domestic audience. They are signaling to foreign creditors that there is still a faction in Washington committed to fiscal restraint. This global perspective adds a layer of complexity to the argument that the United States must lead the world in climate action regardless of the cost. Proponents of the Green New Deal argue that by being the first to invest heavily in renewable infrastructure, America can capture the global market for green technology and maintain its economic hegemony. They view the massive upfront cost as a strategic necessity to prevent rival nations from dominating the energy landscape of the future. In this framework, the high price tag is a small fee to pay for ensuring that the 21st century remains an American century, powered by sustainable innovation. However, the counterargument posits that the sheer weight of the debt required to fund such a transition could undermine the very power it seeks to preserve. A nation burdened by an unmanageable debt-to-GDP ratio may find itself unable to project military power or respond to unforeseen international crises. Skeptics warn that if the United States loses its reputation for fiscal responsibility, it could trigger a flight from the dollar, leading to a loss of global influence that no amount of solar panels could replace. This is the hard power reality that often sits in the background of every budget committee meeting, influencing the decisions of even the most idealistic lawmakers. The discussion then naturally shifts to the question of who will bear the burden of the tax increases necessary to fund these trillion-dollar ambitions. Any serious economic analysis of a major green policy must confront the reality that taxing the wealthy alone is often insufficient to cover the projected costs. This leads to a difficult conversation about middle-class tax hikes, carbon taxes, and the potential for a value-added tax that could change the daily life of every American. When a critic asks for the math, they are often trying to force their opponent to admit that the free programs being promised will actually require a significant sacrifice from the average voter. This transparency is the cornerstone of democratic accountability, yet it is often the first casualty of political marketing. Supporters of expansive policies often use dynamic scoring models that predict massive economic growth to offset the costs, while critics use more static models that highlight the immediate deficit. This battle of the models creates a fog of information that can make it nearly impossible for the public to discern the truth. The role of the fiscal conservative in this environment is to cut through the jargon and ask for the most basic, undeniable numbers that define the limits of the Treasury. Furthermore, the impact of these policies on the banking and insurance sectors is a critical but often ignored part of the budget puzzle. A sudden, government-mandated shift away from fossil fuels could lead to hundreds of billions of dollars in stranded assets, potentially destabilizing the financial institutions that hold those investments. The Budget Committee must consider whether the federal government would be forced to bail out these institutions if the transition is too rapid or poorly managed. This introduces a hidden cost to the Green New Deal that rarely makes it into the viral soundbites but remains a constant worry for economic planners. As the debate matures, we are seeing a growing interest in fiscally neutral climate policies that aim to reduce emissions without increasing the national debt. These ideas, such as revenue-neutral carbon fees, offer a potential bridge between the two camps by utilizing market mechanisms rather than massive government spending. By returning the revenue from carbon taxes directly to citizens, these plans avoid the trap of becoming another line item in an already bloated federal budget. This represents a significant evolution in the discourse, as even the most ardent critics of government overreach are beginning to see the value in targeted, market-based environmental solutions. The psychological toll on the American taxpayer is another factor that must be weighed in these high-stakes hearings. There is a palpable sense of spending fatigue among a population that has seen trillions of dollars in emergency stimulus and infrastructure bills over the last few years. When a politician suggests another massive expenditure, the immediate reaction for many is one of skepticism and concern for their own financial security. The $5 calculator is a powerful symbol because it represents the same tool that families use to manage their own household budgets, creating a relatable point of contact in a world of abstract billions. Ultimately, the clash over the budget is a clash over the definition of essential in the modern American state. Is a stable climate an essential public good that justifies any level of debt? Or is a stable currency the primary foundation upon which all other goods are built? This question does not have a simple answer, and the tension between these two priorities is what keeps the democratic process honest. By forcing a confrontation between these two worldviews, the committee process ensures that neither side can ignore the valid concerns of the other for very long. The role of technology in this debate also cannot be understated, as breakthroughs in fusion, battery storage, and carbon capture could fundamentally change the math of the green transition. If the cost of renewable energy continues to plummet, the need for massive government subsidies may diminish, making the path to a green future much easier for the budget to swallow. Both sides are essentially betting on the speed of innovation, with one side wanting to accelerate it through public spending and the other wanting to let the market lead the way. This shared reliance on future technology provides a rare sliver of common ground in an otherwise divided landscape. As we look toward the final chapters of this legislative struggle, the importance of maintaining a civil and evidence-based dialogue becomes even more clear. The viral moments of confrontation, while entertaining, must eventually give way to the hard work of compromise and the careful drafting of laws. The nation cannot afford to be paralyzed by a permanent stalemate between the visionary and the auditor. It requires a synthesis of both perspectives to create a policy that is both ambitious enough to meet the climate challenge and responsible enough to preserve the nation's financial health. The legacy of these debates will be measured not by who won the most clicks on social media, but by the strength of the economy and the health of the environment 50 years from now. Every number written on a whiteboard and every calculation made in a hearing is a small part of a larger effort to define what kind of country we want to be. The struggle is difficult, the stakes are enormous, and the math is unforgiving, but the process itself is a testament to the enduring power of American democracy. In the end, we are all accountable to the numbers, and the numbers never lie. The culmination of these fiscal debates marks a defining moment in the maturation of 21st century American governance, where the initial euphoria of radical change must finally meet the administrative rigor of implementation. As the dust settles from the high-profile confrontations in the Senate Budget Committee, the focus shifts toward a more sustainable and less performative approach to policymaking. The $5 calculator, once a prop of political theater, transforms into a symbol of a broader demand for transparency that transcends partisan lines. It serves as a reminder that the public's trust is not won through the grandeur of a vision alone, but through the demonstrable competence of those who promise to manage the nation's wealth. In the wake of these intense discussions, a new generation of political leaders is beginning to emerge, those who are bilingual in the languages of both social justice and fiscal discipline. These rising figures recognize that the most effective way to protect the environment is to build a policy framework that is audit-proof, meaning it can withstand the most hostile mathematical scrutiny. By integrating sophisticated cost-benefit analyses into their earliest drafts, they are moving away from the era of aspirational legislation toward a new era of functional progressivism. This shift does not represent a retreat from their goals, but rather a strategic evolution designed to ensure their policies can survive the transition from a campaign slogan to a codified law. The role of the American voter has also undergone a subtle but significant transformation as a result of these televised budget battles. Armed with more information than ever before, the electorate is becoming increasingly sophisticated in its ability to detect the difference between a viable plan and a fiscal mirage. They are no longer satisfied with vague promises of taxing the rich to pay for everything. They want to see the spreadsheets, the timelines, and the contingency plans. This demand for detail acts as a powerful check on the populist impulses of both the left and the right, forcing a level of honesty that was often missing from the political discourse of previous decades. Furthermore, the private sector's role in this transition has become the X factor that both sides must now account for in their calculations. As the federal government grapples with its own debt limits, the massive pools of capital held by institutional investors and global corporations represent the most viable path toward funding a green future. The debate is no longer just about how much the government should spend, but how the government can best de-risk private investments in renewable energy and sustainable infrastructure. This public-private synthesis offers a way out of the budgetary deadlock, allowing for massive societal shifts without placing the entire burden on the taxpayer's shoulders. As the United States continues to navigate its role in a rapidly changing global economy, the ability to maintain fiscal sanity while pursuing technological leadership will be its greatest competitive advantage. A nation that can prove its ability to solve the most complex challenge in human history, decarbonizing an industrial economy, while keeping its financial house in order, will become the blueprint for the rest of the world. The hearings we witness today are the stress tests of that blueprint, identifying the cracks in the foundation before the structure is built. Though the process is often painful and filled with acrimony, it is the only way to ensure that the final product is built to last. The narrative of a clash between a young visionary and a seasoned skeptic ultimately tells a story of a healthy, functioning democracy wrestling with its own limitations. It reminds us that no single person or party has a monopoly on the truth, and that the best solutions are almost always found in the tension between opposing viewpoints. The visionary provides the spark and the destination, while the skeptic provides the map and the fuel gauge. Without both, the journey would never begin or would end in a disastrous stall. This fundamental interdependence is the secret source of the American experiment, allowing for radical progress within a stable, conservative framework. In the final analysis, the mathematics of the budget are not a cage designed to trap our ambitions, but a set of guardrails designed to keep our progress on the road. When we respect the numbers, we respect the labor of the citizens who earn them and the future of the children who will inherit the debt. The debate over the Green New Deal has successfully elevated the national conversation, moving it beyond if we should act to how we can act in a way that is sustainable for the environment and the economy alike. It is a grueling, unglamorous, and essential work that defines the very essence of leadership in a complex age. As we look forward, the whiteboard will be wiped clean for the next session, but the lessons learned in these rooms will remain. We have learned that passion is not a substitute for a plan, and that skepticism is not a synonym for denial. We have learned that the most powerful tool in the arsenal of a democracy is not a weapon of war or a pile of gold, but a simple, clear accounting of the truth. As long as there are those willing to ask the hard questions and those willing to do the hard math, the American dream will remain a solvent and attainable reality for generations to come. The journey toward a better world is always under construction, and the Budget Committee is where the blueprints are checked for errors. It is not the place where dreams go to die, but where they go to become real, grounded in the solid earth of fiscal reality. With every calculation and every confrontation, we move one step closer to a future that is not just green, but gold, a future that is as prosperous as it is pure. The numbers are the language of that future, and we are finally learning how to speak it with clarity and conviction.